Hello and a warm welcome to another edition of the debate on Press TV. I'm your host, Behruz Najafi. Now, as British Prime Minister Theresa May was trying hard to win the support of her party members on a Brexit draft, the agreement received a serious blow when 4 government ministers resigned as a sign of protest. Now, second Brexit minister in 6 months, Dominic Raab, says that May's proposals could lead to a constitutional breakup of the United Kingdom. Jacob Rees-Mogg, a staunch pro-Brexit conservative, has called for May to be removed. Now, the leader of Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, says that the draft deal is a huge and damaging failure. German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe have welcomed the deal, Brussels saying that negotiators have exhausted all margins of maneuver and came up with, quote, the best they can. Now, what's the prospect of a no deal? How could that affect the United Kingdom? These are some of the questions we will be asking at tonight's debate. But first, let's watch a background report.
Disillusioned, concerned and confused. This is how Britons say they feel about their government's draft Brexit deal.
If we're not at the table to actually negotiate and talk and put ourselves forward, when France and Italy and all these other countries are sat at the table making decisions, what's going to happen to us?
But the British Prime Minister says her proposed package is in the interest of the UK.
The Brexit talks are about acting in the national interest. And that means making what I believe to be the right choices, not the easy ones.
Theresa May made the remarks while addressing the UK Parliament over her proposed draft deal. In reaction to her comments, the leader of opposition Labour Party described her plan as a huge and damaging failure for the country.
The withdrawal agreement and the outline political declaration represent a huge and damaging failure.
Jeremy Corbyn demanded Theresa May withdraw her half-baked Brexit deal with the European Union or Parliament will reject it. Right after the clash between May and Corbyn, a senior member of May's party announced he has submitted a letter to Parliament's Speaker demanding a no-vote confidence in Theresa May.
This is nothing to do with me. This is about not having confidence in the current leader and believing that the deal simply does not work.
Jacob Rees-Mogg said May can be replaced quickly within weeks. Earlier, Britain's Brexit Secretary, Work and Pensions Secretary, Junior Northern Ireland Minister and Junior Brexit Minister stepped down over the draft agreement. The issue of a possible hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland still seems to be a nightmare for May. Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party, which has 10 lawmakers in the Parliament, has described May's plan as a humiliation. Opposition to May's draft deal is also loud in Scotland. The Scottish First Minister says the draft agreement between the UK and the EU is bad for Scotland and her party has pledged to oppose the deal. While European leaders and EU officials have hailed May's proposal, the opposition by members of Conservative and Labour parties and threats from Northern Ireland and Scotland suggest that May faces an uphill battle to sell her Brexit deal. Until Thursday, the big question was, can Theresa May lead the UK out of its political impasse? Now, the more important question is, can she survive a possible no-confidence vote or what some call a political coup?
All right, now with that report, let me introduce our guests who are joining us in this debate today. We'll have Secretary General of CIPI Foundation, Paolo Rafona, who's joining us from Brussels, and investigative journalist Tony Gosling from Bristol. Now, let me begin with Paolo. Now, Rees-Mogg has referred to Brexit as a, quote, fantastic opportunity that's, quote, being thrown away. He calls it a failure of the government policy which must be rejected. How do you look at the draft deal? Is it so disastrous as some people have called it?
Well, the draft deal is reflecting what the European Union had been working on for many months. So basically, there is no much of UK input into it. The only point that has been negotiated to an extent that has found a compromise without a definite solution, by the way, is the Northern Ireland issue and the hard border or the soft border in between Northern Ireland and the rest of the Irish Republic part. but is altogether is an agreement in which it is decided to leave, but without a definite time set. So nobody knows as of today how long the implementing negotiations will take. This is assumed to be a long perspective for maybe some years, which means it leaves the UK into a limbo which is outside but is still inside, because the objectives that the same Prime Minister May has outlined in her last press conference will be achieved, but will be achieved once all the negotiations will be concluded, the European Council will adopt it, and the British Parliament will vote for it. So in these terms, I do understand the critics that say this is not a deal, is a promise for a future deal. Meanwhile, we still get under the EU authority, and nobody knows for how long.
Okay, let me go to Bristol now, to Tony Gosling. Theresa May is facing tough opposition from various fronts, as you know. Now, she's facing the threat of a no confidence vote from within her own party. How would a possible no confidence vote affect her deal?
Well, I mean, the deal would be dead if she is voted out from being a Conservative leader. But look, I mean, what you've just heard there is absolutely true. The draft deal that she's presented is the EU deal. So she's basically presented what the EU want. The only trouble is that is never going to get through the British Parliament for all sorts of reasons. One is that the Conservative Party is a minority government. It's relying on the DUP in Northern Ireland, who want a hard border with Southern Ireland in order to get through, and the Labour Party, who want to do anything they can to sink the government. No matter what the deal is, they will be voting against almost anything that the Conservatives can come up with, simply because they want to topple the government. So you've got she has 120 MPs, it looks like, at least short. She needs 320 MPs, and she's only got about 200. So she's got serious problems. This is never going to work, this deal, and the reason is because it's actually, as I said, an EU deal. But this is actually, I think, a bit of genuine drama. The world is watching, because the European Union is one of the most powerful forces in the world today. The EU, Brussels-based, 800 million Europeans, is become a superpower. Whereas in the past, Europeans often have been disunited on various causes, and obviously we've had world wars in Europe. Now they're united, but we'll see if this will succeed as an attempt to unify Europe under one political banner. This was actually started just after the Second World War, this project, by the European movement in 1948, then in 1957 the Treaty of Rome, and in 1992 finally a political union. And people often forget that Margaret Thatcher, whether you love her or hate her, she was well known around the world, Thatcher. She was ousted in 1990 for one reason, and that is because she refused to sign the Maastricht Treaty, which eventually John Major, the Prime Minister, then signed, which was this political union, where the idea was that you might get together with us as a single currency right across Europe. She said, I refuse to hand over this sovereign nation to 13 unelected bankers. And there's a lot of Conservatives now, I think, who are remembering those words, saying that if we're going to get out of the European Union, we have to actually leave. The main problem being that if we don't leave the customs union, which is what Theresa May is proposing for an indefinite period, that means we can't make trade deals with anywhere else in the world. So this is never going to succeed, this deal she's attempting. And I think it's almost inevitable that either she or the government will fall. So it'll either have to be a leadership election, or there'll have to be a general election, in which case we would probably see a completely new government and Jeremy Corbyn come to power.
Okay, to Brussels now. Paolo, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn says that Theresa May should withdraw her, what he calls, half-baked Brexit deal that doesn't even have the support of her own cabinet. How can the opposition affect the divorce deal?
Well, first of all, it seems to me quite clear that the Labour Party will vote against the deal in the Parliament. So those votes will not go in favour of the government. But then many other parties in the Parliament also have announced a negative vote. And we have to see how many of the Tories will vote against, but it seems that the number is growing by the hour. So it is very probable that she may either not pass the vote in the Parliament, or she passes it, but in a very weak position with a little margin. So that's why the BBC reported today during the press conference very clearly outlined the situation. You are in office but not in power. This is what the journalist said. And,
that's right.
Well, Theresa May was not too happy to hear it, but it is the reality of the situation. So I fear that the optimism that existed in Brussels a few hours ago, thinking that well, the deal is done, we prepare for the summit on the 25th to 27th with all the other European partners, and we finally sign it, and we have done. It's now encountering some doubts, at least, because they didn't expect to see a political drama in the UK, which is quite strange. They didn't, because the situation was known even before. But now they don't know what to say, actually, because the deal is there, the EU deal, we can call it, accepted by Theresa May, and probably it may happen that in the coming week, either there is a political crisis in the UK, therefore the government collapses, or Theresa May will resign, and therefore there is a new leadership within the Conservatives. It's a bit of an unpredictable situation, but certainly doesn't look an easy way ahead.
Okay, let's ask Tony Gosling now. Prime Minister May says that the draft agreement, or as Paolo calls it, the EU agreement, is the only way to avoid a no-deal scenario. And she said that she trusted it in this press conference just an hour and a half ago. She said that she trusts in this with every fiber in her body. What's your take on that?
Well, she always says that, and she's very good at making these kind of dramatic statements. But the fact is that we may have possibly had something like what they call the Canada Plus deal, which is where we are able to trade with the European Union. And this is the only other thing I think would work, which is to take a deal off the shelf. That is to say, look at the deals that the European Union is making with other parts of the world, for example, with Switzerland, which is not actually a part of the EU, but it trades with the EU very successfully. And so to take one of those deals and look around the world to see which deals the EU has made and say, well, actually, we like that kind of deal. And to do that deal, I don't think would be necessarily a very difficult thing to do. And there's still a bit of time, not a lot, because what we've had is we've had 2.5 years of Theresa May making a mess of things, because basically she has been a kind of saboteur right in the middle, right from the very start. During the campaigning in the Brexit vote in 2016, she was a Remainer. She didn't want to leave the European Union. It's becoming pretty clear now that she's been spending most of her time trying to work for the European Union, not necessarily for Britain. So this is what happens, I'm afraid, in politics nowadays. It happens all over the world, is that a politician will say one thing and do something completely different. We have to also remember that the EU is changing into a more authoritarian direction at the moment. We've heard that Macron in France and Merkel this week have been calling for a full European army. So, you know, as the EU is changing and the powers becoming more centralised, Britain is not the only country that wants to leave. That is the people who voted to leave. There's also the Hungarians, the Austrians, the Italians, the Spanish, the Greeks, even the French and the Germans. Population want to leave, but they have not been given the opportunity of a vote.
Okay, Paolo, EU officials have warned those who are asking Theresa May to go back to Brussels that negotiators have exhausted the margin of maneuver in the talks, and the draft is, quote, the best we can do. I'm quoting them directly. Now, what is a good deal for Britain, in your opinion?
Well, this is very. I cannot really answer, because the issue is that a referendum gave the opinion of the population, although with a small margin, but it had to be respected. So to leave the EU. Now, how to leave it? It is true that after 40 years of engagement between the UK and the EU is not something you do overnight. But on the other hand, either you live it or you don't. I would like to quote the words of Tony Blair that I heard today in one of his interviews. And he was saying this is a deal that is discontenting all sides, the Remain and the Leave, and even the EU in itself, because you don't get to understand out of this deal what does it change. Basically, everything remains as it is, with the prospect that maybe through further negotiations there will be a disengagement of the UK. So it's more a declaration of principle than the construct.
It looks like we have a bad line with Brussels. Let me go to Bristol, to Tony Gosling. Tony, I got a little question. I wonder if the answer is also as small as the question is. What do you think will be the fate of the border issue between the two Irelands? Tony? Well, Tony, if you hear me, the question I asked you was, what's your opinion about the fate of the border issue between the two Irelands?
Hello?
It was a sabotage. I remember back early this year when they were first announcing, agreed with it, that it was obvious that the idea of a soft border, as they call it, between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland was going to be like a kind of political suicide for any deal that Theresa May wanted to do. Because there you've got two countries. You've got Britain, which is leaving the EU, and Southern Ireland, the Irish Republic, which is staying in the EU, with no border between them. Well, of course you're going to have a border. And to agree to that, really, Theresa May, what she was doing, she was putting a little ticking time bomb into the whole Brexit process. So I think at the end of the day, if Britain does succeed in leaving the EU, there's a lot of pressure by the international oligarchy, the globalists, to stop it. But if we do succeed in leaving the European Union properly, then there will have to be a border there. And I mean, if there was a border for many, many years, for decades, up until we joined the Maastricht Treaty, which helped to bring down that border. But up until the peace process in the 1990s, there was a very strong border there with army checkpoints right along it. You wouldn't need to have such a hard border as that, but some kind of border, of course, is necessary between countries. Britain is used to having a sea border, say, for example, with France and Holland, these kinds of places, because obviously we're an island nation. But that doesn't mean to say that in Northern Ireland, which is a separate part of Britain, that there shouldn't be this one piece of land border. So to agree to that, Theresa May was really trying to scupper the deal in the first place and alienating, most importantly, the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, which is the only party that's keeping her in power.
All right, let me ask Paolo now. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, says that Brexit has strengthened the case for independence because a draft deal, in her words, will devastate jobs and investment in Scotland. Now, what do you think will be the fate of a second independence referendum for Scotland?
I don't know if it will take place and when. There are even hypotheses of a possible second Brexit referendum, but I think these are all speculations. The situation is clear. I mean, the openly said no deal would have been a blow also to the British economy. The solution that Theresa May has worked out with the EU is an undeclared no deal, basically. So we agree, but we don't say how, and it will take time to decide the details. passing it on. Basically, this is where we stand. So the Scottish may agitate themselves, but I don't think it's the right time. I mean, it's the next week is crucial. If Theresa May falls or doesn't fall, or what is the real majority she can get in the Parliament, what will be the declarations of votes during the discussion in the Parliament for the votes. So this is what we have to concentrate on. So it may well be that by the 25th or 27th of November, when the EU has convened this high-level summit, there may be a completely different political situation in the UK. So to discuss about referendums now is a bit of out of place.
Okay. Now let's go to Bristol. Tony, what do you think will happen at 11 p.m. UK time, Friday, 29th of March 2019? Will the UK leave the EU with or without a deal? Briefly, please.
Well, it's very difficult to tell, but I would just remind your viewers about Nicola Sturgeon. She doesn't really represent a broad view of Scotland. I mean, they're a Scottish Nationalist Party. The Scottish people voted to remain within the United Kingdom, not to be a separate country. Also, she is very closely associated with the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is actually a US private lobby group. She does a lot of talks for them. She's very close to them. So she's looking also to try and make sure that the Brexit referendum is overturned. She wants a new referendum. She wants to change the mind of the voters, etc. There's a massive political class which will be disenfranchised if we succeed in leaving. Okay. These are the globalists, the internationalists, and all those politicians will be out on their ear if we have a successful Brexit, which I hope we do next year.
Okay, Paolo, very briefly, your reply to that question?
Sorry, but what was the question? Could you repeat it?
Will the UK leave the EU with or without a deal? Very briefly, please.
My assumption is that there will be no exit of the EU. So there will be a continuing situation of undefined participation with new negotiations. We have to see also what happens in the May elections in the European Parliament, because this will be a critical element. So why to decide it before nobody understands it?
We'll have to wait and see. All right, let me thank our guest who joined us, Secretary General of CIPI Foundation, Paolo Rafona from Brussels, and also investigative journalist Tony Gosling, who joined us from Bristol. Thank you for watching this debate. We'll see you next time.